All right, so thanks for kicking off. Like we've said, we're going to be diving into NYSERDA's Tier 4 RFP today. But before we do so, I did want to provide a little background and kind of set the stage to understand the gap between New York State's clean energy goals as well as its current energy state. So looking at the slide, back in 2015, the Clean Energy Standard was issued to kind of set forth some primary goals that New York State wants to achieve to become more sustainable and adopt renewable energy. So the first is the 70 by 30 goal. And this sees 70% of electricity consumed in New York being renewable by 2030. And initially it was actually 50% by 2030. However, due to progress as well as a greater push for sustainability and renewables, they were able to bump that up to 70%. The second goal is to achieve 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. And finally, there's the GHG reduction. The state wants to reduce 85% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and they're basing this off of their 1990 emissions levels. So now I'm going to pass it off to Gianna on the next slide, where she'll kind of give a better picture of the state's current energy generation as well as distribution.
So I'm here to share the tale of two grids with you. You can see here that the grid upstate and downstate are really different from each other. Upstate, we have predominantly clean energy, while downstate's mostly fossil fuels still. And breaking this down even further, on the zero emission side, upstate New York is fueled by about 41% nuclear, 40% hydro, and 7% wind. And the majority of the fossil fuels that power upstate New York are from gas, about 8% there. Then we go to downstate New York. This is actually from 2020. Indian Point, the nuclear plant just closed down, so it's actually more fossil fuels now. But before it was about 66% gas, oil was about 3%, and zero emissions were comprised of about 25% nuclear, 4% hydro, but that 25% nuclear is gone now without downstate. And you can see in the middle there, like the yellow part, that we have some transmission capabilities and some issues with that. And upstate New York has a lot of renewable energy, but we have some issues getting all that renewable energy all the way downstate. So there's a loss there. Move on to the next slide, back to Ingrid.
Actually, this is my slide that got thrown in there. So one thing I wanted to use to frame this whole discussion, so we already know that there are transmission constraints for getting clean energy to New York City. I just want to give an overview of the levers that can be pulled and the levers that the state are pulling to get New York City off of fossil fuel electric generation. So the main plan the state has right now is offshore wind. They have already put into motion 1,826 megawatts of offshore wind, and there's a goal to eventually have 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind. A lot of this, in fact, I'd probably say about 60% of it, 60 to 70% of it's going to be absorbed by Long Island. You know, over 2 million people live in Long Island. There's a lot of electricity. They live in bigger houses, more cars. It's going to take up a lot of it. But what I did is I got a few different electric measures and then kind of framed it in the percent of NYC's current electric load. Keep in mind, our electric load is probably going to double as we add in heat pumps and electric cars. So if we covered every New York City roof and solar panels, they generate electricity at 16% of their full load max capability, and it'd be at 18.2% of New York City's grid. The original Hydro-Quebec line would have covered 15.9% of New York City's electric needs. Indian Point, if all the energy was just sent straight to New York City, it would have been 32.9% of New York City's load. But I think only like 2/3 of it actually got there. And then not for transmission reasons, just for it being used by Westchester. And then the size of the planned offshore wind, if it all went directly to New York City, would be 15.4% of NYC. When that's fully built out, I expect it to be about 40 to 50% of NYC's current electric load. If we covered Rikers and solar panels for the Renewable Rikers plan, we do about 0.5% of NYC's electric load. And then the entire distributed solar in New York State, as of right now, would be about 2.7% of New York City's yearly electric load. Okay, we go to the next slide.
All right, so now that we've kind of got a little background on energy and electricity in the state, we want to explain a little bit more about NYSERDA. And NYSERDA is the body issuing the RFP that we're looking at today. So NYSERDA is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and they're essentially the energy agency for the state. And they work with a variety of stakeholders to provide information, expertise, funding, and organized programming to advance their mission of increasing energy efficiency, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and transitioning to clean energy. So one of the ways in which they're able to advance their mission is to adopt renewable energy is by incentivizing developers to provide access to renewable energy. And they can incentivize the developers by purchasing RECs, or Renewable Energy Certificates. So renewable energy certificates are issuances that represent 1 megawatt hour of energy that's been created from renewable energy sources. So when energy providers are generating renewable energy, they accumulate a lot of RECs, and there is a market to purchase renewable energy certificates. People and organizations can purchase them voluntarily or to be in compliance with environmental regulation. But basically, they're able to lay claim that whatever energy they consumed was produced from renewable energy sources. So the market and demand for RECs is still growing. And as a result, NYSERDA has kind of stepped in and is guaranteeing purchase of these RECs to kind of reduce the risk for the developer and encourage them to produce renewable energy. On the next slide, we're going to look at the different types of energy developers. The clean energy standard that we had talked about earlier classifies renewable energy developers into 4 different tiers based on how they deliver energy to the state. So under the first tier, we have new renewables, and these are developers that construct new facilities for renewable energy generation. Under the second tier, we have developers that invest in the maintenance of existing renewable energy infrastructure to ensure their continued operations. We also have a competitive tier 2, which is like a sub-tier, and these developers are trying to maximize, or they're building upon the existing infrastructure to maximize contributions and the potential of the operating facilities we have already. Under tier 3, the zero emission credit, this is more or less dedicated to nuclear energy generation. We don't see this tier all too much now because there are various advocates and different advocacy groups pushing for the curtailment of nuclear energy generation. One thing to note is that nuclear energy, even though it's not a renewable energy source, but rather a clean energy source. And finally, we get to tier 4, which is the tier that we're going to be looking at most closely today. So tier 4 developers are those that are increasing access to renewable energy for New York City. And they can increase the access by either constructing a renewable energy plant or facility in New York City itself, or by delivering renewable energy to the city. So as we'll see in the proposals later, almost all of the proposers have opted to purchase renewable energy elsewhere and build power lines that transmit this renewable energy down to the city. They found that it's far more cost effective to build power lines and purchase renewable energy rather than trying to build a renewable energy plant in New York City. I'm going to pass it back to Gianna, and she's going to dive more into the Tier 4 RFP.
We can switch slide. Oh, awesome. A little bit of background on the RFP. RFP stands for Request for Proposal. And on October 15th, 2020, last year, the order adopting modifications to the Clean Energy Standard authorized NYSERDA to purchase Tier 4 RECs. And that offered long-term contracts to different energy generators. So they have two different strategies to be able to reduce fossil fuels under the goal of Tier 4. The first way is by increasing renewable energy resources in New York City. That's Zone J. And the other strategy is optimizing deliverability of renewable energy resources throughout New York State. So both on the production side and the delivery side to get renewable energy to New York. And right now, NYSERDA is seeking to negotiate contracts for up to 3,000 megawatts total. And as of Monday, I think 2,550 were awarded so far. So there's still a little bit more room for more to be awarded here. And this is the timeline. Back in January, the RFP was issued. And by Q3, we're going to have the NYSERDA award notification.
Oh, I guess I'll do this. Ingrid, my internet connection broke down while you were presenting, so we might miss your section, just like 10 seconds of it during the recording. I apologize for that. And then they actually did award the two power lines this week, so we'll go through that at the end. So the award was made because we're in Q3, and it was made on, I believe, on Wednesday. And I just kind of want to summarize this in 3 points. NYC needs clean energy because there's none generated down here. NYSERDA asked for some proposals, and they can bid however they want to bid. They can either bid with solar panels being built in New York City, or they could bring a power line coming down from somewhere outside the city into the city, and they just have to buy credits for upstate generation to be sent on that power line. So, you know, at the end of the day, they're trying to pick proposals to get clean energy or renewable energy into New York City, and we're going to evaluate all the proposals. So I believe next slide I think we'll have Leonard present first.
Hi everybody, I'm Leo. I joined the group it's okay. I joined the group earlier this year. I'm just gonna go over some facts about one of the proposals called Clean Path New York. So it is a, well, I'll go into the details later, but it claims to bring 2.9 terawatt hour of supply to New York City, which represents a fraction of what New York City currently consumes. And that would be made of so 1,800 megawatt hour new solar, 2,000 megawatt hour new onshore wind. 60% of that new generation will be is part of the proposal, and 40% will be outsourced to other companies. The proposal includes the construction of a 175-mile transmission line that we're going to see in a second. This project will cost $11 billion. It claims that over 10,000 new jobs will be created in New York State thanks to it, and that it will generate savings for consumers and as well as tax revenue. The environmental benefits that are claimed in the proposal is that 39 million tons of CO2 will be eliminated. We can go to the next slide. This is the transmission line. So a straight shot from Fraser, New York to New York City is about 115 miles, but the line actually goes specific, rather makes it 175 miles long. Yep. So we want to go over a little bit who's involved in the project. So Clean Path is a joint venture between NYPA and an entity called Forward Power. NYPA is another public benefit corporation that does a whole lot of things related to energy. So does NYSERDA, who is also issuing the RFP. Forward power is just a name for another group of two other things. One is called NV Energy, which is a wind and solar power plant developer and operator, and Energy Re, which is a new spin-off made from principals at Related Company, which is a major developer in New York City that you might know about, who is developer and owner of Hudson Yards. There's also a few other actors in the mix, those financial advisors that we think is worth noting, some of the banks that we know. And the last line there are some of those clean energy suppliers that are included in the 40%. So just broadly looking at those proposals, obviously we're not making our we're not the ones choosing, maybe unfortunately, which ones are getting awarded the project, but kind of our gut reaction to this is that, you know, well, there's some pros to this, the ones that are claimed environmentally and economically. The fact that it's short term, so construction should begin in 2024, and they say that operations should start in 2026. That's interesting. There's also a bunch of stuff that have not, to our knowledge, been mentioned in the proposal. For example, how a lot of things related to the environmental impact assessment and how the impact on the wetlands will be mitigated for underwater lines mostly. It also raises the question of control of the vertical market, right? Because this includes generation of energy and also distribution to the city. And finally, we all have a lot of thoughts about the people that are involved in the related companies. I think that's it for this proposal. Thank you.
Cool. Up next, we have Steve talking about the Catskills Renewable Connector.
Hey folks, I don't see my picture in the screen, so can you all hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
See you.
All right, cool. It's always weird when I can't actually see myself. I think it's showing everyone else but me. All right, I'll just assume I am in focus. So hi everybody, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Catskill Renewable Connector, which is one of the pretty interesting proposals that they are making here. The basics, hold on, let me get to the right page, I've got notes here. So this is a project by Rise and Light Power. They're formerly known, they did a bit of a rebranding by their former namesake, which is Ravenswood, which is of course the facility shown in this picture here. The facility is the largest baseload plant within the city. Can we go to the next slide? So they haven't really disclosed the exact route, but the approximate route here is shown on this map. Basically, it consists of electric converter stations in Greene County and Queens, New York. It's basically connected by approximately 115 miles of fully underwater underground cable. A large proportion of them are traversing below the Hudson River. Not all of it, but they have said that it's all being done through private right-of-ways. So there's no need to do any, what's the word? No eminent domain needed for any of these things, and no private properties to go on through, all public. They gave examples other than the rivers as like public highways that they can work with or things like that. So yeah, at full capacity, the proposed transmission line is expected to supply up to about 15% of the city's electric needs, or about 1,200 megawatts. Construction is expected to begin in 2023, and they hope operations can begin as soon as 2026 if things were to go smoothly. Next slide. So the group's really trying to be the climate and racial justice proposal. They've gotten a lot of buy-in from various number of different groups, including endorsement from the NAACP, and they also got buy-in from the local Queensbridge tenant leadership. For those that are not familiar, Queensbridge houses, they're the largest NYCHA complex, and they're actually the largest public housing complex in the entire country. For years, Ravenswood has kind of been generating right next to them, so they've been a major environmental justice issue. So they are trying to supposedly change that image. They also got what's it called? And apparently the NYCHA leadership agrees with this because they've been bought in. Queensbridge houses also is of course the birthplace of hip hop. Fun fact. unless you happen to believe it's the South Bronx. Very, very controversial. They also have partnered with the Utility Workers Union of America, Local 1-2. They're starting a new apprentice program. They're putting a couple $1 million into that to bring more jobs in the area. They're basically trying to figure out ways that they can bring more jobs to like Queensbridge houses and the surrounding neighborhoods to get more local support. Next slide, please. So LS Power, they're the company that owns Rise and Light. They're a fairly experienced company. You can see that, there's a lot of projects in this map. They're all projects of theirs that they've been developing. I don't see it here, but I know they're also working on something called a New Jersey connector. That's going to be a large battery facility that's on the site of a former coal plant, which is pretty cool. They're actually trying to do a similar thing here with the Ravenswood facility, where they'll be replacing some of the peaker plants that we're retiring with battery storage. Now, the company's hired a lot of new leadership for Rise and Light, most of whom have direct experience with wind development. I got a chance to speak to the CEO a couple months ago. They said that they're trying to be the American version of Ørsted, which, of course, for those familiar, it's a wind developer that used to be an oil company. So it's a successful. It's an example of a successful transfer of a major dirty energy group to a clean energy group. They said that's what they're trying to kind of model. So yeah, the function of this project is simple. It's a power highway. It's a transmission line. The point is to bring upstate renewable energy downstate. Specifically, they're focused on wind and solar projects. They predict that it's going to increase wind generation upstate by 15% and solar by 49%. Now, for those of you not familiar with the problem of renewable energy upstate, there's a lot of space upstate to build renewable energy. There's not as much consumption upstate. So you can build all the renewable energy you want. It doesn't matter unless you have someone to use it. So the point of this thing is to basically connect areas and provide enough transmission space to help develop upstate wind and solar in areas that currently are fairly low demand. It's expected to decrease gas demand by 11% and reduce emissions by 10% statewide and 15% in the city alone. Now, I did press the company about when they said that they're going to reduce gas demand by 11%. I specifically have asked them if they're going to be reducing usage of Ravenswood by 11%. They would not commit to a number. I know that a couple other environmental groups had asked them about that, and they did not commit to a specific number of their personal reductions. But that's neither here nor there, depending on who you ask. I'm not one of those people that would say that, but trying to be impartial. Next slide, please. So the takeaway, the pro is it has potential to displace peak plant, has a potential to replace some of the power at Ravenswood. It is landing at Ravenswood. It is specifically going to be hitting in the same place, using a lot of the same facilities, makes it easier to develop, also makes it readily able to integrate with the grid, and also makes it pretty easy to reduce the need for Ravenswood over time. It's possible. And also LS Power, they're very experienced. They've done a lot of this. They seem to have a pretty good mission trying to convert to renewable energy. And like they've been like walking that walk. They seem to actually be doing that, which is good. The cons, now developer, of course, they own Ravenswood. Ravenswood is, of course, a massive gas plant. Not great, though they've been trying to do some green things to fix that. Although I repeat, do not have any plans to retire their major facilities. And of course, another con, most of these projects you're going to find are largely redacted. There's not a lot that's shared with the public quite yet. Hopefully, as the process moves on and we get to public comment periods, we'll have more information about the various projects as far as like the details go. And next, please. So the Tier 4 connector, I don't have much to say about this because, as I said, a lot of them are redacted. This one is heavily redacted. Same company, LS Power, although not under Rise and Light. It's basically taking something from an existing station in Rockland County and bringing it to Manhattan. Why Manhattan? I am unsure. So a very, very important need we have in New York City is to deal with the expanding amount of demand in the outer boroughs. It's where a lot of the development is happening. It's where a lot of economic development is happening. We need more power there, and we need to also rapidly get to a point where we can reduce the amount of natural gas out there and hopefully eliminate eventually. To do that, we're going to need to get as much power into the outer boroughs as possible. Manhattan, less so. So I'm a little confused by that one. They are the only one that connects to Manhattan. That's, and then I'm sure they have a reason for that, but it's redacted. I personally do not see the reason for that. There's no information on the RFP that isn't redacted, not even the megawatts, not even the power line. All we know is that Zealous Power seems okay. As far as the developer goes, that's all we got. Next, it's going from a gas done some major improvements there though, so let's hope they did. Next one. I'll go right to the takeaway because like I said, there's not a ton on this that we have. Pros, LS Power experience doing this, so we know that they can do it. It's the only line that connects to Manhattan. If there's a very good reason to get things to Manhattan, perhaps finding more ways to green the area. That would be the only one that does that directly. Cons, doesn't go very far upstate. It's a little unclear about how this is working. Like I said, we do really need more electricity going directly into Queens and Brooklyn. Developer, of course, once again, LS Power, they do own fossil fuel generation. And the proposal, of course, is mostly redacted, so we don't know a ton about it. I think that's all I got. I'll go ahead and pass it off.
Thanks, Steve. Up next, we have Tom talking about ConnectGen.
Hey, so the next one is interesting, not because of what they proposed, but more because of what they didn't propose. So this project, the basic details are that it's 3 in-state solar resources. They're in state, but they're still pretty far away. For example, the one on the map is 310 miles away from Manhattan. And they have experience building previous solar plants. It is contingent on Hydro-Quebec happening in order for this one to actually be able to be connected. And that's because the main issue with this project is that ConnectGen have not really proposed any significant new connection capacity. So they've not really proposed building like a big interconnect like the last proposal we looked at, which is a bit odd because it makes it hard to see how this proposal actually meets like the definition of tier 4 that's required for the RFP. And it sort of brings up the basic point of like, if we want state in general to fund some projects and they can't fund all of them, then what will give us the most effect for money spent? And one could argue that if the limiting factor for clean energy generation getting to New York City is the transmission, then the money should go towards projects that build transmission. And then the idea being that the cheapness of solar and wind in a competitive market helps those big projects to happen anyway. So this project also, given that they're only building solar, it's hard to argue that it's going to have sort of the additionality that you might want, i.e. that it's going to happen regardless of whether or not it gets, hard to argue that this wouldn't have happened in an alternate world where it wasn't funded. Yeah, so not necessarily that much to recommend this one, but kind of interesting in the lack of actual large interconnects.
And next up, we have Hillary. Is this for Excelsior or is this a slide I never saw?
This is Max 911, which was another proposal that was sprinkled in here. But as I dug into it, it was so heavily redacted. Yeah, it was so heavily redacted that we couldn't really learn a lot from it. So I even, showed you what we have here. And I even tried to dig in. They don't have any information on a website, not even their own website. They don't have a footprint in the US at all. We did see proposed capacity, which was 1,200 megawatts. Location storage was redacted. Route was redacted. resources required were redacted, and apparently it's all because they have this patent for transmission that is pending. So they even redacted the information, I think, in their original proposal, which I'm sure, as you can all figure out how well that went, like, hey guys, we have this great idea, but we can't tell you yet. So we don't really know a ton about it. But my own personal note is that if they do have these patents pending, hopefully they come through and it'll really open up an amazing way for us to get transmission in the future. So there's nothing here that we can really expand upon because there's not a lot known about it, about the company or about the actual route itself. Steve is right. Spoiler, they didn't make it.
Hillary, I believe this is you as well.
Hillary, if you're not prepared to do Avangrid, I could absolutely present on
Yeah,
it.
Nat, I'm gonna go ahead and pass it to you.
Okay, no worries. Let me remove your spotlight. Let me spotlight myself. Okay, this one was kind of slapped together real quick, so I apologize if it's not as thorough as the other one. So Excelsior Connect is another power line. It almost follows the exact same path as the NYPA clean path power line. It just doesn't go as far upstate. And it's being developed by Avangrid. Avangrid, I believe, is like a European utility company. They actually own two utilities upstate, New York State, NYSEG, I forgot the acronym, New York State Electric and Gas, and Rochester Gas and Electric. Both these areas have tons of like clean electricity. They take a note. One thing that's really interesting that was kind of a point in the clean path proposal is when all these developers have to propose these power lines, they also have to procure clean electricity to transmit on the power line. So they have to buy the rights to electricity generated upstate so that can be the power that's being sent on the line instead of whatever gets to the power line. So they're kind of a bit like salty that this RFP put the burden on the transmission developer to acquire the clean energy resources. They were like, hey, NYSERDA, why don't you do that? So you guys can do the calculations and not have to rely on the proposals for evaluating that. So again, it begins in Monticello, New York, and it ends at the Rainey substation in Queens. So again, I believe Rainey is the Ravenswood substation. So that is in Astoria. It actually goes above ground pretty much all the way until right where the Hudson like meets Manhattan. And then it actually does an underwater crossing of the Hudson, stays in the East River and connects to Ravenswood. And again, they advertise it as an underground energy highway. So it's like all completely buried. And they're like, no, it's not running in water like the Champlain Hudson Power Express or the Catskills Renewable Connector. It is buried. And I think like, yeah, 95% of it's like on I-87 on the throughway. So I'll go to the next slide. Sorry, I didn't type this up better, but basically it's just a little background about Avangrid. They have like a subdivision that specifically develops power lines, and they've made power lines. They're actually developing the New England Clean Energy Connect. So I guess that's a partnership with Hydro-Quebec to bring Quebec hydropower to Boston. They're originally trying to develop it through New Hampshire. New Hampshire said no. I think Maine's like going to say no. I don't know, but they can't just get it directly into Massachusetts, even though Massachusetts wants it. So they're working on that. And then Vineyard Wind is an offshore wind project off the coast of Massachusetts or like somewhere in New England. So they have some experience doing this stuff. Having Avangrid on board was a positive. Next slide. So yeah, I actually copied a picture of the New York Clean Path, the NYPA related power line. So that one starts at the Fraser substation. This one starts at the Cooper's Corner substation in Monticello near the famous racetrack. And on the left, you can see kind of the Google Maps of how far it's going. My opinion, the farther upstate we get the power lines, the more likely you're able to get the clean energy from upstate. So I kind of favor the NYPA one a bit over this solely based on that reason. And then, it's underground all through, this one's underground all through here until it gets to Astoria. And the next slide. So yeah, pros. Oh wait, I forgot to change the title on this one. I changed the pros and cons for the Avangrid power line. So Excelsior Connect, Avangrid's experience. It's a buried line. Some people might be more comfortable with a buried line instead of an underwater line. I like the underwater lines better, but this is fine. And the line doesn't go as far upstate. in my view, buried lines are a lot more expensive to build, so it might take a little bit longer, but they did not have a construction timeline on this proposal. And then we'll go into the Champlain Hudson Power Express. So this is the Hydro-Quebec line. They're partnered with Blackstone, our favorite or least favorite real estate developer, I believe. Sunrise has protested them a few times. The nice thing about this is that this line is fully permitted. They basically have all the permissions from every town up and down the Hudson, and reviews, I think, by the Army Corps of Engineers and like whatever New York State needs to permit. This was a really funny thing. De Blasio and Cuomo actually agreed on this power line, which you never see. And construction could it could be operational by 2025. Clean Path New York could be operational by 2026. The other thing about this is that all the other power lines get solar and wind energy from upstate New York. This one's connected to Montreal. Sorry, Steve says my internet is glitching. Can y'all hear me now?
It's better now.
Okay. This one is connected to Montreal, and Quebec overbuilt their hydropower. So they flooded a bunch of indigenous hunting grounds back in the 60s. And now they have this electricity resource and they've been trying to export it. So that being said, it's pretty much available around the clock anytime that's needed. They might have some days in the winter where their hydropower is overtaxed, but it basically have a 95% capacity factor. So the amount of energy you get per each megawatt is going to be a lot more. And then likewise, they actually do advertise the power going both ways. So if there's a time where New York is producing too much wind power, they could send it to Quebec. Quebec will ramp down their hydropower and take our excess. So like mathematically, I like this line. It's really good from an engineering perspective. Next slide. So this is the route. So what was really interesting is two of the proposals, I believe it was the NYPA one and this one, had to submit with a converter station. So I don't want to go too down the rabbit hole of explaining high voltage DC current, but long story short, our grid is AC. These long transmission lines end up being DC. And if you want to connect your AC power generation to this DC power line, you need a converter station. So they submitted one proposal on the left that was a straight shot from Quebec to New York. In Quebec, it would go DC, high voltage DC all the way down, more efficient, and then back to AC. This one would put a converter station in New Scotland so that any local wind power or solar power could connect to this converter station and then add capacity for those upstate resources to send power to New York. I actually don't know which version of these NYSERDA picked. The converter station seems like a good idea to me. I don't know why you wouldn't have it. Maybe it's a bit more expensive. The other thing is that the blue is where it's underwater. The green is where it's above ground. And point to note, near Westchester County and Rockland County, there's an above ground section where the Hudson River is undergoing soil dredging for environmental remediation. So they specifically did not lay the power line in that area because the EPA won't allow them to. Okay, next slide. What's really interesting, so I took a screenshot earlier this week at like 10 o'clock, and New York State was actually importing about 1,500 megawatts of hydropower from Quebec. We already have the connections for that much. That's part of the like that 40% hydropower upstate split between the Niagara power facility, the New York State dams, and the Hydro-Quebec dams. The other interesting thing on the right is if you look at the price of the Hydro-Quebec resource, it's basically the cheapest electricity among all the options that New York State has. So we pay 20 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity in New York City. People in Quebec pay 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So they pay a quarter of the price. And as a result, most of their heating isn't fossil fuel, most of their heating is electric. So the benefit is that we'd actually see our prices go down even more so than it would go down with wind and solar. Let's go down, next slide. This is a screenshot of where the actual hydropower dam is. So most of the dams, in fact, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but you kind of see these blue splotches, like there's like 4 at the top near the 540.15 mile marker. Those are the actual reservoirs. So those are the areas that they flooded up in northern Quebec. And then the lines go about 500 miles to the closest city center, which is like Quebec City. So it's all very far. The population density up here is like less than a person a mile. Again, one of the main indigenous concerns was indigenous hunting grounds. So that was, they pretty much messed up that implementation back in the 60s. And we could do a whole forum like literally just on that. But it's it's a concern of some environmental groups that these were created from here. And does it make moral sense to accept this hydropower? Next slide. They've actually gotten some union support. So they got International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 3, and the International Union of Operating Engineers. So they have the New York State Conference, which is like Local 94 in New York City, and some other ones around the state. So that, Quebec's Hydro-Quebec's done their homework here. Next slide. I guess I think I had a slide in them on their Quebec statement about their relationships with the indigenous people. There's been some concern that if they build these hydropower lines, they'll have to flood more areas. Quebec insists that all their new generation will be mostly wind, and Ontario will pursue more nuclear energy. So I don't really see much issue with that, but others are free to disagree. Sierra Club and National Resource Defense Council has said that putting the power line under the Hudson could release some chemicals. I don't think that's really a founded concern. We've run all sorts of lines underwater before, internet lines, power lines, etc. And there's been, some indigenous people have supported the line. There's at least a story or two of some not. So, that's a whole thing to digest. And yeah. As kind of an overview of all the proposals, NYSERDA did decide to award Clean Path New York, the NYPA related one, and the Champlain Hudson Power Express, the Hydro-Quebec one. If you look at the gigawatts of clean energy per year, those two actually produce the most energy going into New York City. They're all about the same size, 1,200 megawatts, but again, the Champlain Hudson Power Express has a higher capacity factor. It's also the farthest from NYC. I guess ConnectGen is where the panels are, but of the transmission lines, it goes Hydro-Quebec, Catskills Renewable Connector, then the NYPA line. And then the injection point, I actually forgot to update these. The Clean Path and Excelsior both connect to Ravenswood, and the Champlain Hudson Power Express connects to the Astoria, Northern Astoria generation station where the transformer exploded like 2 years ago, the Astoria Borealis. And that's the one where they're Sunrise is actively fighting the new gas power plant that's being proposed in North Astoria. So what NYSERDA picked was one to connect to Ravenswood and one to connect to North Astoria. ConnectGen, they're just upstate, and then Tier 4 connector connects to the West 48th Street substation.
Okay, well, we can open up. The first question is, how do y'all feel about these, the ones that NYSERDA has selected? This is the Clean Path New York and the Champlain Hudson. And I go back to the previous slide with the outline. Does anyone have any thoughts on these two here?
Can I offer some clarification there?
Say that again. I heard that.
So can I offer some clarification there?
Sure.
So yeah, they put out a statement this past week. What's it called? Announcing that 2 of these projects have been selected to move to the next level. The 2 that were selected to go to the next level were the Clean Path New York plan, also known as the NYPA plan, and the Champlain Hudson Power Express, which is the Hydro-Quebec plan. Now, those ones will next go to like a public approval process, in which case they can be altered or changed. Theoretically, they could also go to other projects as well if there is strong opposition to one of them, which I suspect there might be. So yeah, so right now where we're at is these 2 are moving forward in the approvals process now, and they're going to public comments in the coming months. And yeah, the others are right now kind of back to the drawing board to be potentially considered again later if things don't go well for one of these projects, or potentially just not to get this offering, but maybe a future one. So yeah, that's why that we said those two were selected.
Gotcha.
Dave, can we go back to that previous slide, the breakdown? Thank you.
Matt, I don't know if you can edit these on the fly and if they'll show up here, the injection points for these two.
That's a good
Ravens
question.
one.
Let me see if that works.
Yeah.
That was on my to-do list to go fix that, and then I was busy with work. My bad.
I do believe you'll have to end the presentation and start it again to show the updates. Just so you know.
While we're going through this, I think Paula has a question and or comment.
Thanks, Hillary. I think the thing that I just like flagged in my own brain was the complicated relationship between the Indigenous communities in Quebec and the Hydro-Quebec Blackstone, which is what we said the Champlain-Hudson Power Express would be working with. That's my like concern from a personal perspective, but it seems like a very complicated kind of issue in that regard. That's the only thing that's like flagging in my brain from this.
I know recently, so there's a couple different Indigenous groups that have voiced concerns with this specific plan. One of them, which was the Mohawk. The Mohawk have actually entered an agreement since then that would offer them some money for this project, which is important because it goes directly through their land. Personally, I think that's kind of a baseline. If you're using someone's land, you should probably pay them. Development of new dams or continuance of utilizing some of the dams that are on their tribe's traditional lands that have asked organizations and have asked states and cities to refrain from buying this power until they can reach a settlement, and that is ongoing. So some of that was mitigated. The Mohawk people have accepted payment for use of their land, but some other tribes are still trying to specifically get that. I don't remember the names of the tribes offhand, unfortunately, but I can find that out if people want more detail.
But did anyone still want to read that? Is anyone still reading this?
In the spirit of chat moderation, Vikas has a question.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I should probably do it.
Yeah, so because this is a screenshot from the Hydro-Quebec proposal, and the black bars is actually what was redacted. I don't know if it's by the proposer or by NYSERDA, but like.
Reading what Hydro-Quebec thinks about Indigenous people. But my question was actually, I sort of asked this in the chat, but I guess I'm curious, like, Matthew made this comment about preferring underwater versus underground because it's cheaper. And there was a couple other comments about the various environmental impacts of either. And I guess sounds like around, like some of the proposals are underwater, some are underground, and some are a mix. And so I'm curious how to if anyone wants to like talk further about what the trade-offs are, particularly from an environmental justice or environmental damage perspective.
I can take that if anyone else wants to. Yeah, so there's a couple different issues. So both burying and underwatering lines is generally speaking both more expensive and preferable to doing things above land. You've all probably seen those gigantic transmission lines that are above land, like the gigantic metal towers. Those are fairly affordable to do, but they're not resilient when it comes to being exposed to the elements. You have a very, very big windstorm or like a tornado or something like that, and they go bye-bye. So it's generally preferable for resilience purposes, especially as we have an increasingly angry at us climate, that they are somehow under some sort of protective body. Now, burying lines tends to be very expensive, but it's a very, very safe way to do things. If they're buried, they've got a nice hardy layer of the earth around them. They tend to be a very, very safe way to do things. But it can depend on like where you're digging those things. For instance, if you're digging through an area that is in a watershed, and you're digging through an area that might have traditionally house some sort of toxic industry. If you're upping that sediment from that burial area and that goes into runoff, you can get an issue where you have like heavy metals and stuff like that burning off into drinking water, which not great. Alternatively, it's a little cheaper to do just less disruptive and quicker to do things when you're talking about underwatering lines. You're kind of rolling them out. It's a pretty quick way and efficient way to do things. And when we're talking about developing renewable energy projects, time is very, 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 very important. The one issue that comes with it, though, is that often when you have a body of water that traditionally has had heavy industry on it, like the Hudson River, often, there's a couple different kinds of pollutants. Some pollutants just wash down the water. Some pollutants kind of settle. And when they settle, they become part of the sediment. And the sediment lies there and eventually gets buried. And if it's not disturbed, hopefully does not get back into the water and does not flush out into the ocean. There's risk when you're underwatering lines that you can kick up sediment. And if you kick up a lot of sediment, what that does is it releases whatever those toxins are down that water, down that river, which naturally is not great. That means that those toxins will get into whatever is downstream of it. So there's a risk there, and mitigation is very, very, very important when we're doing that. Hopefully, they should have a mitigation plan. Any of these projects should have mitigation plans, and that obviously should be a thing that they're probably going to be addressing in the public comment period when they're having these forums. And if this is something that we support, it's probably one of the things we should definitely focus on outside of what's called Indigenous justice issue.
Now, Steve, to put some perspective on this, because like one, hey, sorry, can y'all?
Matt, you could try dialing in on your phone.
It's not my phone. I have two Wi-Fi connections on my computer, and one of them doesn't exist, and it keeps on switching over to the other one. So it's not. I should have just used my work laptop. So two things to note about the environmental stuff. So the Hudson River has been very, very, very polluted for hundreds of years. GE just like dumped toxic chemicals that are super settled that are like all in the settlement, and like they don't let people swim in the Hudson River. It's like so polluted like every day. Now they've cleared it for secondary contact, like you can jet ski on it. The triathlon does involve like swimming across the river, so it's actually improved dramatically, but it went from like GE completely messing it up for 50 years, a huge environmental remediation program. And in that one section in Rockland County where they put it above water, I believe it's an EPA Superfund site, but what that basically consists of is they have these big boats with these huge scoops, and they're just constantly scooping huge, like big buckets of dirt out of the bottom of the Hudson River continuously every single day. And what they do is they scoop it up, they put it on a container ship, and they get rid of it somewhere, right? So what doesn't make any sense to me, and that's why I think this whole concern about releasing pollutants for the underground power lines is just like, quite frankly, complete bullshit, is they're literally scooping big mounds of dirt all the time, completely disturbing the worst part of the Hudson that has the most sediments in it whatsoever. And to think that laying down a power line down the Hudson would cause more kickup or sediment release than what they're already doing every day in the Hudson just makes absolutely no sense to me. Now, granted, we could reach out. So there are plenty of people that study the Hudson River, plenty of scientists that would more than be willing and happy to talk about like any one of these things. And as a part of our due diligence, I recommend maybe we do that. We reach out to them and be like, hey, what is, what is the expert opinion here? But the Hudson's already kind of treated as a polluted source. So any potential sediments that get brought up during the laying of the underground power lines for any of the proposals, it's not really going to affect anything. We're not drinking water from the Hudson. We're not like, it all goes to the ocean and gets diluted. And then they're just already kicking up like an absurd amount of stuff continuously all the time. So I think the backlash you hear about that specific part, I don't think it is rooted in science.